The golden light of the setting sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Silver Creek as Thomas Quinn guided his horse toward the livery stable. The year was 1878, and after 3 months driving cattle from Texas to Colorado, all he wanted was a hot meal and a soft bed. His body ached from the saddle, his skin weathered from weeks under the relentless western sun. At 32, Thomas had spent more than half his life on horseback, and the lines etched around his eyes spoke of both hardship and quiet determination. He dismounted with a weary grace, patting his chestnut stallion's neck before leading him into the stable. The familiar scents of hay, leather, and horse welcomed him, but as he walked deeper into the dimly lit building, another sound caught his attention. A muffled sob, barely audible, coming from the far corner where shadows gathered thick and heavy. Thomas paused, his hand instinctively moving to the Colt revolver on his hip. Years on the frontier had taught him caution. But something about the soft crying, distinctly feminine, stirred something else in him. Not alarm, but concern. "Hello," he called out, his voice low and steady. "Someone there?" The crying abruptly stopped, followed by a sharp intake of breath and rustling hay. Thomas reached for a lantern hanging near the stable door, striking a match against his boot to light it. The warm glow pushed back the darkness as he moved slowly toward the source of the sound. "I know you're there," he said, holding the lantern higher. "You don't have to hide." In the flickering light, he saw her. A young woman with copper-colored hair crouched behind a stack of hay bales, her face tear-streaked and pale. She wore a once fine dress now torn and dirty, and a nasty bruise colored her left cheek. Her eyes, wide with fear, caught the lamplight like green glass. "Stay back," she warned, her voice surprisingly steady despite the tears. "I'm not going anywhere with you." "Madam, I don't know who you think I am," Thomas said, stopping several paces away and lowering the lantern slightly. "But I'm just a cowboy looking to stable my horse for the night." The woman studied him warily, her gaze taking in his dust-covered clothes, the worn leather chaps, and the honest exhaustion in his face. Something in her posture relaxed slightly, though the wariness remained. "I'm Thomas Quinn," he continued. "Just rode in with a cattle drive from the south. Now, might I ask what's got a lady hiding in a stable at dusk?" She hesitated, wiping hastily at her tears with the back of her hand. "I'm Penelope Calloway." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "And I'm hiding from my husband." Thomas's expression remained neutral, but his eyes sharpened. "Your husband gave you that bruise?" Penelope's hand unconsciously touched her cheek, and she nodded once. "He's the banker in town," she explained, her words coming faster now. "Everyone thinks he's respectable, generous. No one would believe." Her voice faltered. "I believe you," Thomas said simply. The 3 words hung in the air between them. Penelope looked up at him, really looked at him for the first time, surprise evident in her face. "You don't even know me." "Don't need to know you to see that bruise, madam." Thomas set the lantern down on a nearby barrel and reached into his saddlebag, pulling out a clean bandana. He offered it to her. "Mind if I sit?" After a moment's hesitation, she nodded. Thomas lowered himself onto a hay bale a respectful distance from her, his movements deliberate and unthreatening. "How long you been married?" he asked. 3 years, Penelope replied, dabbing at her eyes with his bandana. "It wasn't always like this. Edward was charming when we met in St. Louis. My father had just died, leaving substantial debts. Edward offered security, a fresh start out west." A bitter laugh escaped her. "How naive I was. When did it change?" "After we moved here, about 6 months in. Small things at first, controlling what I wore, who I spoke to. Then came the shouting, the accusations. Tonight was the worst it's been." She gestured to her bruised face. "I ran. I didn't know where else to go. The sheriff's in his pocket and I have no family here. Thomas nodded, taking this in. He'd seen this story before in frontier towns, women trapped with nowhere to turn. The West was unforgiving to most, but especially to women alone. "You got somewhere safe to stay tonight?" he asked. Penelope shook her head. "I can't go back," he said next time. She couldn't finish the sentence. Thomas considered for a moment, rubbing his jaw where several days' worth of stubble had accumulated. "There's a widow woman who runs the boarding house at the edge of town. Mrs. Abernathy. Tough as rawhide and fair-minded. I've stayed there before. She might take you in, no questions asked." Hope flickered in Penelope's eyes, quickly replaced by caution. "Why would you help me? You don't know me." "My ma taught me better than to leave someone in trouble when I could lend a hand," Thomas replied simply. "Besides, I've been riding with cattle for 3 months. Would be nice to do something for a person who doesn't moo at me for a change." That unexpected bit of humor drew a small, surprised laugh from Penelope, a sound that somehow brightened the dusty stable. "I have no money," she admitted. "Edward keeps everything locked away." "Let me worry about that," Thomas said, rising to his feet. "Wait here while I stable my horse. Then we'll get you somewhere safe for the night and figure the rest out tomorrow." As Thomas tended to his horse, Penelope watched him from her place in the shadows. His movements were efficient and gentle with the animal, his broad shoulders carrying a quiet strength. He wasn't handsome in the conventional way her husband was. Thomas was all angles and weathered skin, with crow's feet at the corners of his eyes and hands calloused from years of work. But there was something in his steady gaze that made her trust him, despite every instinct warning her against trusting any man again. 20 minutes later, they slipped out the back of the stable into the gathering darkness. Thomas had given her his spare coat to hide her torn dress and distinctive hair. They avoided the main street, taking back alleys until they reached a modest 2-story house on the outskirts of town, its windows glowing warm against the twilight. Mrs. Abernathy, a stern-faced woman with iron-gray hair and shrewd eyes, took one look at Penelope's bruised face and ushered them inside without a word. Only when they were seated in her kitchen with steaming cups of coffee did she speak. "Edward Calloway's work, I reckon," she said bluntly. Penelope's startled eyes shot up. "You know, woman my age sees plenty without being told," Mrs. Abernathy replied. "That man's fooled most of the town with his Sunday manners, but not me." She turned to Thomas. "Good of you to bring her here, Quinn." "Figured she'd be safe with you, madam," Thomas responded. "Can she stay? I'll cover her board." Mrs. Abernathy waved away his offer. "Keep your money, Cowboy. I've got a room upstairs, hasn't been used since my niece left for California. Girl can stay as long as she needs." Relief washed over Penelope's face. "I don't know how to thank you." "No need for thanks," the older woman said, "but we'll need to figure what comes next. Edward Calloway isn't a man who lets go of what he considers his property." Her eyes narrowed. "And he'll be looking for you come morning, if not sooner." Thomas nodded gravely. "I'll stay in town a few days, help sort this out." It wasn't what he had planned. He'd intended to collect his pay and move on, as he always did. But something about Penelope's situation had stirred a protective instinct he couldn't ignore. "You've already done more than enough," Penelope protested. "I've done barely anything yet, madam," Thomas replied, "and I don't make a habit of starting things I don't finish." Later that night, after Mrs. Abernathy had shown Penelope to a small but clean room upstairs, Thomas sat on the boarding house porch, smoking a cigarette and watching the quiet street. The town of Silver Creek had settled into nighttime stillness, with only the occasional light and piano music spilling from the saloon 3 blocks away. He wasn't sure what had compelled him to get involved. In his years drifting across the Western territories, Thomas had made it a point to mind his own business. It was safer that way. Attachments meant complications, and complications could get a man killed out here where the law was often just a man with a tin star and subjective judgment. Yet something about Penelope, Calloway's quiet dignity in the face of her fear, had reached past his careful detachment. Perhaps it was the memory of his own mother, who had endured his father's rages until consumption had taken her when Thomas was just 14. He had left home that same year, unable to bear his father's house without her buffer of kindness. Thomas extinguished his cigarette against the porch rail, his mind working through what tomorrow might bring. Edward Calloway wouldn't take his wife's disappearance lightly. As the town banker, he would have influence with local law enforcement. They would need a plan. Inside the boarding house, Penelope stood at her bedroom window, watching the shadowy figure of the cowboy on the porch below. The room around her was simple but clean: a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a washstand with a porcelain basin, a small chest of drawers, and a rocking chair near the window. It was the first time in 3 years she had been in a room where she didn't feel Edward's presence looming over her. She touched the bruise on her cheek, wincing slightly. It had been so long since anyone had shown her kindness without an ulterior motive that she hardly knew how to receive it. Mrs. Abernathy had provided a nightgown, some salve for her bruise, and a promise that her door had a strong lock. Small mercies that felt enormous after years of having her privacy and dignity systematically stripped away. Penelope wondered about the cowboy who had found her. Thomas Quinn. His name fit him somehow, straightforward and unpretentious. She had seen genuine concern in his eyes, not the calculation she had grown accustomed to seeing in Edward's. But experience had taught her to be wary of apparent kindness from men. Edward, too, had once seemed kind. Still, as she watched Thomas rise from his seat on the porch and pace the length of the boardwalk, she felt something she hadn't experienced in a very long time. Hope. Small and fragile, but unmistakably there. Dawn broke over Silver Creek with streaks of pink and gold painting the eastern sky. Thomas had managed a few hours of sleep on a lumpy sofa in Mrs. Abernathy's parlor, rising before the sun to check on his horse and take stock of the town in daylight. As he'd expected, it was a typical frontier settlement, a main street lined with false front buildings, including a general store, 2 saloons, a hotel, and at the far end, a solid brick building that must be the bank where Edward Calloway presided. By the time he returned to the boarding house, Mrs. Abernathy had breakfast on the table: eggs, bacon, biscuits, and strong black coffee. Penelope joined them, looking better rested, though the bruise on her face had darkened overnight. She wore a simple dress borrowed from Mrs. Abernathy's niece, her copper hair pulled back in a modest bun. "Morning," Thomas nodded, taking care not to stare at her bruise. In the daylight, he could see she was younger than he had initially thought, perhaps 25 or 26. There was a gentle refinement to her features that spoke of an Eastern upbringing, at odds with the frontier town around them. "I've been thinking," Mrs. Abernathy announced as she poured coffee. "Penelope can't stay hidden forever. This town's too small and Edward's too powerful. She needs to get away, start fresh somewhere else." "I agree," Thomas said, buttering a biscuit. "Question is how. I reckon her husband will be watching the stage office and the livery." "I have a sister in Denver," Mrs. Abernathy offered. "She'd take you in, help you get established." She turned to Penelope. "But getting you there is the trick." Penelope looked down at her barely touched plate. "I have nothing. No money, no clothes except what I'm wearing. Edward would never grant me a divorce, even if such a thing were possible here." Thomas cleared his throat. "I know a freight driver heading to Denver tomorrow. Fellow named Jackson. Honest man. He might be willing to take you along if we make it worth his while." "With what?" Penelope asked, frustration edging her voice. "I told you I have nothing." Thomas met her gaze steadily. "I've got my pay from the cattle drive. Should be enough to see you to Denver and keep you a while until you find work." Penelope stared at him, astonishment clear on her face. "Why would you do that? You don't even know me." "Let's just say I've seen what happens to folks with nowhere to turn in this country," Thomas replied, his voice matter of fact. "Besides, I've no family to spend it on, and saloons and card tables just take a man's money without giving much back." Mrs. Abernathy nodded approvingly. "That's settled then. I'll send word to my sister. Meanwhile, you'd best stay out of sight, Penelope. I'll go to the general store later, get you a few necessities." The plan seemed sound, but as they finished breakfast, a sharp knock at the front door made them all freeze. Mrs. Abernathy motioned for Penelope to go upstairs while she answered it. Thomas positioned himself in the kitchen doorway, hand resting casually near his holster. The visitor was Sheriff Mills, a portly man with a drooping mustache and perpetually damp-looking eyes. Thomas had met his type before, not cruel necessarily, but beholden to whoever held the most power in town. "Morning, Mrs. Abernathy," the sheriff said, removing his hat. "Sorry to disturb you so early, but I'm looking for a missing woman, Mrs. Edward Calloway. Her husband is mighty concerned. Says she was upset last night and ran off, worried she might be confused or hurt." Mrs. Abernathy's face remained impassive. "Haven't seen any confused women, Sheriff, just my boarders." She gestured to Thomas, who nodded politely. Sheriff Mills squinted at Thomas. "You just passing through, mister?" "Came in with the Tyler outfit yesterday," Thomas confirmed. "Planning to rest up a few days before moving on." The sheriff nodded, seemingly satisfied, but his eyes continued to scan what he could see of the house. "Well, if you happen to see Mrs. Calloway, pretty woman, red hair, let me know right away. Mr. Calloway is offering a $50 reward for information leading to her safe return." $50 is generous," Mrs. Abernathy remarked dryly. "Must love his wife something fierce." "Worried sick," the sheriff agreed, missing her sarcasm entirely. "Says she's been melancholy lately, might not be in her right mind. Dr. Wilson's seen her for female hysteria more than once." Thomas's jaw tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. It was an old tactic, a husband claiming his wife was mentally unsound to explain away bruises or erratic behavior caused by fear. After the sheriff left, they gathered in the kitchen again, the mood considerably darker. "He'll be back," Mrs. Abernathy predicted, "and he won't be alone next time. Edward will have half the town looking for her with that reward money dangling." Thomas nodded grimly. "We need to move up our timeline. I'll find Jackson today, see if he can leave tonight instead of tomorrow." "And if he can't?" Penelope asked, her voice small but determined. "Then I'll take you myself," Thomas decided, surprising even himself with the offer. "I know the trail to Denver. It would mean a few days hard riding, but we could stay ahead of any pursuit." "You do that?" Penelope's green eyes searched his face. "You'd risk yourself that way for a stranger?" Thomas met her gaze steadily. "Way I see it, madam, right and wrong don't change based on how long you've known someone." That afternoon, while Penelope remained hidden upstairs, Thomas went about his errands in town with deliberate casualness. He collected his pay from the cattle drive boss, purchased supplies at the general store, and visited the livery to check on his horse. All the while, he kept his eyes and ears open. The town buzzed with gossip about Penelope's disappearance. In the saloon where he stopped for a noon meal, he overheard several versions of the story, each painting Edward Calloway as the concerned husband and Penelope as everything from delicate and unbalanced to ungrateful and rebellious. Gave her everything a woman could want, one man declared to his companions at the bar. Fine house, pretty dresses, and this is how she repays him. Some women don't know when they're well off, another agreed, shaking his head. Thomas kept his opinions to himself, nursing his whiskey and observing. Edward Calloway himself came into the saloon briefly, conferring with the sheriff in a corner. He was a handsome man in his 40s, expensively dressed, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to deference. Nothing in his public demeanor suggested the cruelty Penelope had described, which made him all the more dangerous. When Thomas finally located Jackson, the freight driver was loading crates behind the general store. A bearish man with a grizzled beard, he listened to Thomas's proposition with narrowed eyes. Helping a woman run from her husband could bring a heap of trouble, he said bluntly. Especially when that husband's the only banker in town. What if that husband's been using his wife as a punching bag? Thomas countered. Jackson spat to the side. Ain't our place to get between a man and his wife? Maybe not, but it is our place to help someone who's asking for it when we can. Thomas pulled out a leather pouch. I've got $30 here. It's yours if you take her to Denver. Another 20 when you get her there safely. The freight driver eyed the money, then looked back at Thomas. You sweet on this woman or something? Just trying to do right, Thomas replied evenly. Jackson considered for a long moment, then nodded. All right, but we leave at midnight, not before, and if there's any trouble, I never met you or her. Understand? Understood. As Thomas walked back toward the boarding house, he felt eyes on him. Glancing across the street, he saw Edward Calloway watching him from the doorway of his bank, his expression unreadable at this distance. Thomas tipped his hat in casual acknowledgement and continued walking, his pace unhurried despite the prickle of warning at the back of his neck. He didn't know if Calloway suspected anything, but the man hadn't become the most powerful figure in town by being unobservant. They would need to be extremely careful leaving town that night. Back at the boarding house, Thomas found Penelope in the kitchen helping Mrs. Abernathy prepare supper. There was something domestic and peaceful about the scene that caught him off guard. Penelope with her sleeves rolled up, flour on her cheek, laughing at something the older woman had said. For a moment, he simply stood in the doorway, struck by how young and alive she looked when not shadowed by fear. She noticed him and smiled tentatively. Mrs. Abernathy's teaching me to make proper biscuits. Apparently, I've been doing it wrong for years. City girls, Mrs. Abernathy snorted good-naturedly. Think cooking means telling the kitchen maid what to prepare. In my defense, I did try to learn from our cook in St. Louis, Penelope protested, but father thought kitchen work beneath a Calloway. Your maiden name was Calloway too? Thomas asked, surprised. No, Campbell, Penelope Campbell. A shadow crossed her face. I haven't heard anyone call me that in so long. Thomas liked the sound of it. Penelope Campbell. It suited her better than Calloway somehow. Jackson's agreed to take you, he told her, changing the subject. You'll leave at midnight. I've paid him to get you all the way to Mrs. Abernathy's sister in Denver. Relief flooded Penelope's face, followed quickly by apprehension. What about you? I'll see you safely out of town, then I reckon I'll move on. Wyoming, maybe. Heard they're hiring hands at some of the big ranches up there. Something like disappointment flickered in her eyes, but she quickly masked it. Of course. You've already done far more than I had any right to expect, Mrs. Abernathy looked between them with a knowing expression that Thomas deliberately ignored. As evening fell, they finalized their preparations. Thomas brought his horse around to the back of the boarding house, ready for a quick departure if needed. Penelope changed into practical traveling clothes. Mrs. Abernathy had procured a simple skirt and blouse, sturdy boots, and a warm coat. Her few possessions fit easily into a small carpet bag. They ate supper together, the mood subdued but determined. Mrs. Abernathy pressed a letter for her sister into Penelope's hand, along with a small pouch. "A little mad money," she explained when Penelope tried to refuse. "Every woman should have something that's just hers. My Hiram taught me that before the consumption took him." At 11:30, Thomas went to scout the route to the freight yard where Jackson would be waiting. The town was quiet, most windows dark. Only the saloon still showed signs of life, piano music drifting into the night. He circled back, satisfied their path seemed clear. "Time to go," he told Penelope when he returned. She nodded, squaring her shoulders. The bruise on her cheek stood out starkly against her pale skin in the lamplight. Mrs. Abernathy hugged her firmly. "You write when you're settled," the older woman instructed. "And remember what I said, you're stronger than you know." Thomas led the way, keeping to the shadows of buildings and alleyways. Penelope followed close behind, moving with surprising stealth in her borrowed boots. They had almost reached the edge of town when Thomas heard voices ahead, men's voices, one of them unmistakably the sheriff's. He threw out an arm to stop Penelope, pulling her into the shadow of a woodshed. A patrol of 3 men passed at the end of the alley, lanterns swinging in the darkness. "Calloway's got the sheriff checking every route out of town," Thomas whispered. "We need another way." Penelope's eyes were wide with fear, but she nodded resolutely. "What do we do?" Thomas thought quickly. "We go cross-country. Cut through the fields south of town and circle back to the freight yard. It'll take longer, but we'll avoid the patrols." They backtracked, slipping through backyards and garden patches until they reached the outskirts of town. Open country stretched before them, fields of wheat and corn, silvered by moonlight. They would be exposed crossing it, but less likely to encounter Calloway's men. Thomas offered his hand to help Penelope over a low stone wall. She took it without hesitation, her fingers warm and slender in his calloused palm. Something about that simple contact, the trust it implied, stirred an unfamiliar feeling in his chest. They moved as quickly as they could through the fields, staying low when possible. Penelope never complained, though Thomas could tell she was tiring. The town girl had more grit than most cowboys he'd known. After nearly an hour of careful navigation, they approached the freight yard from the south. Jackson's wagon was there, loaded and ready, the driver pacing impatiently beside it. "Thought you weren't coming," Jackson growled when they appeared. "Had to take the scenic route," Thomas replied. "Town's crawling with search parties." Jackson cursed under his breath. "All the more reason to get moving. The woman can ride up front with me. We'll stick to the main Denver road, less suspicious than trying back trails." Thomas helped Penelope into the wagon, handing up her carpet bag. She looked down at him, her face half hidden in shadow. "I don't know how to thank you," she said softly. "No need for thanks, madam. Just stay safe." Penelope hesitated, then leaned down and kissed his cheek, quick and light as a butterfly's touch. "I won't forget this. Ever." Before Thomas could respond, a shout echoed from the direction of town, followed by the thunder of approaching horses. "They've spotted us," Jackson hissed. "Go, I'll get her out of here." The freight driver cracked his whip and the team lurched forward. Thomas slapped the rear of the wagon. "Head for the river crossing. They'll expect you to take the bridge." As the wagon pulled away, Thomas untied his horse from a nearby post and swung into the saddle. He could see riders approaching, at least 4 of them, led by Sheriff Mills. Without hesitation, Thomas spurred his horse in the opposite direction from Jackson's wagon, making himself a conspicuous target. "There he is." The shout confirmed his plan had worked. The pursuit veered toward him, giving the freight wagon a chance to disappear into the night. Thomas pushed his horse hard, racing along the edge of town and then cutting sharply east, away from both the Denver road and the river crossing. If he could lead them on a long enough chase, Jackson and Penelope would have time to get well ahead. The riders behind him were gaining ground. Thomas heard a rifle crack, then a bullet whined past his ear. They were shooting to wound, not kill. They wanted him alive to find Penelope. That knowledge gave him an edge. He could take risks they couldn't. He veered suddenly toward a gulch that cut across the prairie. It was a dangerous jump in the dark, but his chestnut had heart. They soared across the gap, landing hard on the other side. Behind him, he heard shouts and the scramble of horses pulling up short. That would buy him some time. Thomas pressed on, circling wide through the night until he was certain he had lost his pursuers. By dawn, he had looped back to a position overlooking the Denver road, several miles from Silver Creek. There was no sign of Jackson's wagon, which was good. They must have made it past the river crossing safely. Thomas slumped in his saddle, suddenly aware of his exhaustion. The adrenaline of the chase was wearing off, leaving him drained. His horse needed rest too, its flanks heaving from the night's exertions. He found a secluded spot in a stand of cottonwoods near a small creek and made a cold camp. As he unsaddled his horse, Thomas realized he had left his bedroll and most of his supplies at the boarding house in the hasty departure. He still had his saddlebags with basic provisions, his pistol, and the clothes on his back. It would have to do. After tending to his horse, Thomas settled against a tree trunk, hat pulled low over his eyes. He should sleep, but his thoughts kept returning to Penelope. Had she gotten away clean? Would she be safe in Denver? Would she build a new life there, perhaps eventually find someone worthy of her trust? The thought of Penelope with another man brought an unexpected pang of something. Not quite jealousy, he had no right to that, but something adjacent to it. Regret, maybe. They had known each other less than 2 days, yet Thomas felt a connection to her that defied easy explanation. He dozed fitfully, waking at every sound. By midday, he decided it was safe to move on. The smart play would be to head north immediately, put as much distance as possible between himself and Silver Creek. Edward Calloway wasn't likely to pursue beyond his sphere of influence, and Thomas had planned to head to Wyoming anyway. Instead, he found himself riding parallel to the Denver road, keeping to the ridgelines where he could watch without being seen. There was no rational reason for it. Penelope was long gone, hopefully halfway to Denver by now. Yet something compelled him to make sure, to see some sign that she had truly escaped. Around sunset, he spotted a solitary rider approaching from the direction of Silver Creek. Thomas tensed, watching the figure draw nearer. It wasn't the sheriff or any of the men who had chased him the previous night. As the rider came into clearer view, Thomas recognized Mrs. Abernathy's farmhand, a taciturn fellow named Illy. Thomas hesitated, then guided his horse down to intercept the man. Illy didn't seem surprised to see him. "Mrs. Abernathy said I might find you watching the road," the farmhand said by way of greeting. "She sent me with news and your belongings." He patted a bundle tied behind his saddle. "What news?" Thomas asked, anxiety tightening his chest. The lady made it through. "Mrs. Abernathy got a telegram from her sister this afternoon. Said a freight wagon arrived with a package she'd been expecting." Illy's normally expressionless face creased into a slight smile. "She also said to tell you Calloway's in a righteous fury. Got the sheriff convinced you kidnapped his wife. There's talk of bringing in a federal marshal." Thomas absorbed this information, relief at Penelope's safe arrival mingling with concern about his own situation. If federal lawmen got involved, this could get complicated fast. "You'd best keep moving," Ellie advised, handing over Thomas's bedroll and saddlebags. "Mrs. Abernathy says to tell you you're welcome at her place if you need it, but might be safer for everyone if you didn't come back to Silver Creek for a good long while." Thomas nodded. "Thank her for me. And thank you for bringing my things." Ellie tipped his hat and turned his horse back toward town. Thomas watched him go, then continued his own journey, now angling northeast. He had friends in Wyoming who wouldn't ask too many questions if he showed up looking for work. The big outfits up there were always short-handed, especially as fall roundup approached. As night fell, Thomas made a proper camp, grateful for his bedroll as the September air turned crisp. He built a small fire, brewed coffee, and ate a simple meal of jerky and hardtack. The stars emerged overhead in the vast prairie sky, countless and brilliant. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to truly feel the weight of what had happened. He had risked his life and future for a woman he barely knew, made himself a wanted man in the process. By any logical measure, it had been foolish. Yet as Thomas stared into the dying embers of his fire, he couldn't bring himself to regret it. Penelope's face appeared in his mind, not frightened and tear-stained as he had first seen her, but as she had looked in Mrs. Abernathy's kitchen, flour on her cheek and laughter in her eyes. That image seemed worth whatever trouble might come his way. With a sigh, Thomas rolled himself in his blankets and closed his eyes, pushing thoughts of copper hair and grateful green eyes away. Tomorrow would be another day of hard riding, putting distance between himself and the complications he had left behind. 3 months passed. Thomas found work at the Rocking W Ranch near Laramie, Wyoming territory. The owner, Walter Wilson, was a fair man who paid well and asked few questions about his cowboys' pasts, so long as they worked hard and caused no trouble. The ranch was vast, running 5,000 head of cattle across rolling grasslands that stretched to the horizon. Thomas fell easily into the rhythm of ranch life up before dawn, long days in the saddle, evenings of simple food and occasional poker games in the bunkhouse. The work suited him, and the remoteness of the ranch meant news traveled slowly. No federal marshals appeared seeking him, and gradually the tension in his shoulders began to ease. Still, he thought of Penelope often. In quiet moments, riding fence lines or keeping night watch over the herd, her face would come to him unbidden. Thomas had never been given to flights of fancy or romantic notions, but something about the brief connection they had shared haunted him. In late December, heavy snow blanketed the Wyoming range. Work slowed as cattle were moved to sheltered pastures and fed hay from the summer's cutting. 2 days before Christmas, Wilson sent Thomas and another hand, a young fellow named Riley, into Laramie for supplies. The town was decorated for the holiday, wreaths hanging on doors and candles glowing in windows. After loading the ranch wagon with the needed provisions, Wilson had instructed them to stay overnight rather than risk the worsening weather. "Get yourselves a hot meal and a proper bed at the hotel," the rancher had said, pressing extra money into their hands. "Consider it a Christmas bonus." They stabled the team at the livery and headed to the hotel, a 2-story building on the main street that boasted hot baths and clean sheets. As they entered the lobby, stamping snow from their boots, Thomas froze. Sitting in a chair near the fireplace, a book open in her lap, was Penelope. She looked different. Her copper hair was styled more simply, her dress practical rather than fashionable, and the haunted look had vanished from her eyes. But it was unmistakably her. As if sensing his gaze, she looked up. Recognition dawned on her face, followed by pure, uncomplicated joy. "Thomas," she breathed, rising to her feet. Riley glanced between them curiously. "You know this lady Quinn?" Thomas couldn't find his voice for a moment. Yes, he finally managed. Old friend. Penelope crossed the lobby toward them, her movements unhurried but purposeful. I never thought I'd see you again, she said when she reached them. Not here of all places. Riley, showing unexpected tact, muttered something about checking on their room and moved toward the front desk, leaving them alone. What are you doing in Laramie? Thomas asked, still trying to process her presence. I thought you were settled in Denver. I was for a time. Penelope smiled, and Thomas noticed a new confidence in her bearing. I worked as a teacher at a girls' school there, but I wanted something else, a completely fresh start. So you came to Wyoming. The territory was hardly the first choice for a woman seeking refinement or opportunity. I came looking for you, Penelope said simply. The directness of her answer stunned him. How did you even know where I was? I didn't, not exactly. Mrs. Abernathy's sister had connections in Cheyenne. They helped me narrow it down to a few of the bigger ranches in the territory. I've been making inquiries for weeks. She hesitated. Perhaps I shouldn't have. If you'd rather I hadn't, no, Thomas interrupted, finding his voice at last. No, I'm glad you did. I've thought about you. Often. A blush colored her cheeks. And what you did for me, Thomas, no one has ever shown me such kindness without wanting something in return. They stood looking at each other in the warm lobby, snow falling softly outside the windows. Thomas was acutely aware of his trail-worn clothes and unshaven face compared to her neat appearance. Have you eaten? He asked finally. The hotel restaurant is supposed to be good. Penelope's smile widened. I'd like that very much. Over dinner, they exchanged stories of the month since their parting. Penelope had indeed found shelter with Mrs. Abernathy's sister, who had helped her secure a teaching position. The school had been good, the work satisfying, but she had felt restless. I kept thinking about what you said that night, she explained, twisting her napkin in her fingers. About right and wrong not changing based on how long you've known someone. It made me realize how much of my life I've spent living by other people's rules, first my father's, then Edward's. And now, Thomas asked, now I'm trying to live by my own. She met his eyes directly. That's why I came looking for you, not because I needed rescuing again, but because I wanted to see if what I felt, what I thought I saw between us was real. Thomas swallowed hard. He had never been good with words, especially words about feelings, but Penelope deserved honesty. I'm just a cowhand, he said carefully. Don't have much to offer a woman like you. A woman like me, Penelope raised an eyebrow. What kind of woman do you think I am, Thomas? Quinn? Educated. Refined. Used to better than what a saddle tramp could provide. Penelope laughed, the sound warm and genuine. I was refined and married to a wealthy man once. Look how well that turned out. She leaned forward. What I want now is a good man. One who sees me, really sees me, and still thinks I'm worth something. Her directness both unnerved and attracted him. Thomas had known plenty of women in his travels, but most relationships had been transactional or temporary. No one had ever looked at him the way Penelope was looking at him now, as if he mattered, as if what lay between them was something rare and valuable. I'm not good at this, he admitted. The talking part. Then don't talk, Penelope suggested, her eyes sparkling with a boldness he wouldn't have expected from the frightened woman he'd found in a stable. Just listen. I've spent 3 months building a life of my own, making my own decisions. And one of those decisions was to find you, to see if you might feel even a fraction of what I feel when I think of you. Thomas reached across the table and took her hand. It was a forward gesture for a public place, but he couldn't help himself. Her skin was soft against his calluses. I feel it, he said simply. Have since that night in the stable, never made much sense to me, but there it is. Penelope's smile was radiant. So what do we do now? It was a fair question. Thomas had no ready answer. His life didn't easily accommodate attachments. He owned little more than his horse, saddle, and the clothes on his back. He'd been drifting for so long, the thought of settling somewhere permanent was foreign. "I don't rightly know," he admitted, "but I'd like to figure it out, if you're willing." Penelope squeezed his hand. "I am." The next day, Christmas Eve, Thomas introduced Penelope to Riley and explained their connection, a simplified version that omitted Edward Calloway's abuse and the dramatic escape from Silver Creek. Riley accepted the story without question, his young face lighting up at the romance of a chance reunion. With the town largely closed for the holiday, they spent the day walking through snow-covered streets, talking more freely than they had at dinner. Thomas told her about his childhood in Missouri, his mother's early death, and his years moving from ranch to ranch across the West. Penelope shared stories of her life, before Edward, her schooling in St. Louis, her dreams of becoming a writer, her father's financial troubles that had led to her marriage. "I used to keep a journal," she confessed as they paused on a bridge overlooking a frozen creek. "Edward found it once and burned it, said a proper wife had no need for such foolishness." Thomas's jaw tightened. "Man like that doesn't deserve the name of husband." "No," Penelope agreed quietly. "But I've stopped letting him define me, even in his absence. I've started writing again. Small pieces for now, observations, memories. Someday I might try for publication." The pride in her voice as she spoke of her writing touched something deep in Thomas. Despite everything she had endured, Penelope had retained her sense of self, her dreams. It was a kind of strength he admired profoundly. As evening fell, they returned to the hotel where a Christmas Eve dinner was being served in the dining room. The atmosphere was festive, with evergreen boughs decorating the walls and candles on every table. Thomas felt out of place in his plain clothes among the town's more prosperous citizens, but Penelope seemed perfectly at ease, her hand tucked into the crook of his arm. After dinner, they stood in the hotel corridor where their paths would separate for the night. Thomas to the room he shared with Riley, Penelope to her own. "I have something for you," she said, reaching into her pocket and withdrawing a small package wrapped in brown paper and string. "It's not much, but when I saw it, I thought of you." Thomas took it carefully. "I don't have anything for you. You've already given me the most valuable gift possible," Penelope replied. "Freedom." Somewhat self-consciously, Thomas unwrapped the package. Inside was a small leather-bound notebook, its cover embossed with a simple design of a horseshoe. "I thought maybe you could write down your own stories," Penelope explained. "All the places you've seen, the things you've done, they shouldn't be lost." Thomas ran his thumb over the smooth leather, deeply touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. No one had given him a Christmas present in years, let alone one so personal. "Thank you," he said, the words inadequate for what he felt. Penelope smiled up at him, her eyes reflecting the soft light from the wall sconces. Thomas hesitated only a moment before leaning down to kiss her. It was a gentle kiss, almost chaste, but it carried the weight of everything unsaid between them. When they parted, Penelope's cheeks were flushed, her eyes bright. "Merry Christmas, Thomas." "Merry Christmas, Penelope." The next morning dawned clear and cold, the world outside transformed into a glittering wonderland of fresh snow and blue sky. Thomas rose early, his mind made up after a night of restless thinking. He found Riley already awake, packing their few belongings for the return journey to the ranch. "I need to talk to Wilson when we get back," Thomas told him. "About my position at the ranch." Riley looked up, surprised. "You thinking of moving on? Because of the lady?" "Not exactly moving on, more like putting down roots." The words felt strange in his mouth, but right. Understanding dawned on Riley's young face. Well, I'll be Thomas Quinn thinking of settling down. Never thought I'd see the day. Neither had Thomas, but meeting Penelope again had crystallized something he'd been feeling for months. The restlessness that had driven him from place to place for nearly 20 years had finally begun to fade. Perhaps it was time to build something that would last. He found Penelope in the hotel dining room, breaking her fast with toast and coffee. Her face brightened when she saw him, and that simple reaction confirmed his decision. "I've been thinking," Thomas said without preamble as he sat across from her. "Wilson, my boss at the Rocking W, has a small cabin on the property that's sitting empty. The previous foreman used it before moving to his own spread. Wilson mentioned once he might let me have it if I wanted to stay on permanent like." Penelope set down her coffee cup, her expression carefully neutral. "Are you thinking of staying on permanent like then?" "I am," Thomas confirmed, "if I had a reason to." "What sort of reason would you need?" Her voice was steady, but Thomas could see the hope in her eyes. A compelling one. He reached across the table, taking her hand as he had the night before. One with copper hair and green eyes who writes stories and isn't afraid to chase what she wants across half the territory. A smile bloomed across Penelope's face. "That sounds like a very specific reason." "It is." Thomas took a deep breath. "I know it's sudden. We've spent more time apart than together, and I'm not a rich man or an educated one, but I think we could build something good if you wanted to try." Penelope's fingers tightened around his. "Are you asking me to marry you, Thomas Quinn?" "I reckon I am." He met her gaze steadily. "Though I understand if you need time to think on it, or if you'd rather not leap into another marriage so soon." "Time to think on it," Penelope repeated, a hint of laughter in her voice. "Thomas, I crossed 300 miles of snow and mountain passes to find you. I think I've had plenty of time to consider what I want." Hope flared in Thomas's chest. "And what is it you want, you?" she said simply. "A life with you, however that looks." The directness of her answer, the absence of conditions or hesitations, left Thomas momentarily speechless. He had expected at least some reservation, given her experience with Edward. But Penelope was looking at him with absolute clarity and certainty. "It won't always be easy," he warned. "Ranch life is hard, especially for a woman used to town comforts." "I'm stronger than I look," Penelope reminded him, "and I've discovered I quite like challenges." Thomas couldn't help but smile. "That you do." Later that day, as they prepared to leave Laramie, Penelope to gather her few possessions from the boarding house where she had been staying, Thomas and Riley to return to the ranch with their supplies, they made plans to meet again in 1 week's time. Thomas would speak to Wilson about the cabin and his intentions to stay on permanently. "What if he says no?" Penelope asked as they stood outside the livery, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. "Then we'll figure something else out," Thomas replied with a confidence that surprised even him. "There are other ranches, other towns. The important thing is that we do it together." Penelope stood on tiptoe to kiss him goodbye, a public display that would have been shocking in more refined circles but felt perfectly natural here in the rugged simplicity of Wyoming. "1 week," she promised. "Don't keep me waiting, Cowboy." Thomas watched her walk away, her straight back and purposeful stride so different from the frightened woman he had found hiding in a stable. Pride and affection swelled in his chest. Whatever the future held, he knew with bone-deep certainty that finding Penelope Calloway Penelope Campbell had changed the course of his life irrevocably and for the better. The week that followed was the longest of Thomas's life. Wilson, to his credit, took the news of Thomas's matrimonial intentions with good-humored surprise. "Never figured you for the marrying kind, Quinn," the rancher remarked as they sat in his office, a glass of whiskey between them to ward off the winter chill. "But I've always said a good woman makes a man better at his job, not worse. The cabin's yours if you want it. Could use some fixing up, but it's sound." Relief washed over Thomas. "Thank you, sir. I appreciate the chance." Wilson waved away his gratitude. "You're a good hand, Quinn. Hate to lose you to wanderlust. If a wife keeps you anchored here, all the better for the rocking W." He took a sip of whiskey. "When do I get to meet this woman who's managed what no trail boss or rancher could, getting Thomas Quinn to plant his feet?" "Soon," Thomas promised. "I'm meeting her in Laramie this weekend." The cabin, as Wilson had warned, needed work. It was a simple structure, one main room with a stone fireplace, a small bedroom, and a lean-to kitchen. The roof was sound and the walls sturdy, but years of minimal occupancy had left it dusty and bare. Thomas spent every spare moment of the week cleaning, repairing, and preparing it for Penelope's inspection. Riley and some of the other hands, caught up in the romance of the situation, pitched in with unexpected enthusiasm. One contributed a rocking chair his sister no longer needed, another found curtain material in town, a third repaired the sagging front step. Their generosity touched Thomas deeply. By Saturday, the cabin, while still modest, had been transformed into something resembling a home. Thomas rode into Laramie with a mixture of anticipation and nervousness he hadn't felt since his first cattle drive as a teenager. Penelope was waiting at the arranged meeting place, the small park near the center of town. Despite the cold, she stood outside, wrapped in a blue woolen coat that brought out the copper highlights in her hair. When she saw Thomas approaching, her whole face lit up in a way that made his heart skip. "You came," she said as he dismounted. "Said I would, didn't I?" Thomas replied, taking her gloved hands in his. Penelope laughed. "Yes, you did. You're a man of your word, Thomas Quinn. It's one of the many things I admire about you." They spent the day together, making arrangements that would have seemed impossibly hasty in another context, but felt perfectly natural to them both. The local minister agreed to perform a simple ceremony the following day. Penelope had already packed her few belongings, ready to begin her new life. That evening, as they walked through the quiet streets after dinner, Penelope suddenly stopped. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her expression serious in the lamplight. "About me? I know we haven't had the most conventional courtship." Thomas considered his answer carefully. "I've spent most of my life alone, moving from place to place, never staying long enough to put down roots. Met all kinds of people, good and bad, but I never met anyone who made me want to stop moving until you." He touched her cheek gently, tracing the spot where the bruise had been when they first met. "That night in the stable when I found you crying, something changed for me. Can't explain it better than that. Just knew you were someone worth knowing, worth helping, worth loving if you'll let me." Tears shimmered in Penelope's eyes, but they were happy tears. "I'll let you," she whispered. "I already do." The next day, January 2, 1879, they were married in a brief ceremony attended by Riley, Wilson, and a few townspeople Penelope had befriended during her stay. She wore a simple dress of deep green that matched her eyes, with a sprig of winter holly in her hair instead of a veil. Thomas had purchased a new shirt and string tie for the occasion, feeling awkward but determined to do right by his bride. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas kissed Penelope with a reverence that belied his usual stoicism. The small gathering applauded, genuinely happy for the unlikely couple who had found each other against considerable odds. Wilson insisted on hosting a modest reception at the hotel, where he raised a toast to the newlyweds. "To Thomas and Penelope Quinn," he said, glass held high. "May your life together be as vast and beautiful as Wyoming itself, and considerably less windy." The laughter that followed was warm and sincere. Thomas, unaccustomed to being the center of attention, found himself surprisingly at ease. With Penelope beside him, her hand tucked into his, he felt a sense of rightness that transcended his natural reserve. Later, as they prepared to ride back to the ranch, Penelope, now mounted on a gentle mare, Wilson had provided as a wedding gift, Thomas looked at his wife with wonder. The journey that had begun with her tears in a stable at Dusk had led to this moment of perfect clarity. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. 5 years later, the cabin had expanded into a proper small house, with a garden that flourished under Penelope's care, and a corral where Thomas trained horses when not working for the Rocking W. They had 2 children, a son named James, now 3, with Thomas's quiet nature and Penelope's green eyes, and a daughter, Lily, just a year old, already showing signs of her mother's spirit and determination. Penelope's writing had found modest success, with several stories published in magazines back east. She wrote in the evenings after the children were asleep, tales of the West that captured both its harshness and its beauty. Thomas read every word with pride, though he still struggled with writing himself. The journal she had given him that first Christmas contained mostly brief entries about the children's milestones and notable ranch events, but it was a start, they had heard through Mrs. Abernathy's occasional letters, that Edward Calloway had eventually remarried a wealthy widow from Denver. The news brought no pain to Penelope, only a quiet thankfulness that another woman's suffering had freed her to find genuine happiness. On the anniversary of their meeting, Thomas made a point of lighting a lantern at dusk and placing it in their window. When Penelope asked why, he simply said, "To remind us both that sometimes the best things start when someone stops hiding." She would smile and kiss him, understanding the reference to that first night in the stable. Then they would sit together on the porch, watching the stars emerge over the Wyoming plains, their children sleeping safely inside, their future stretching before them as vast and full of possibility as the western sky. And Thomas, who had once believed himself destined to drift forever, would look at the family he had found and marvel at how a moment of simple human kindness, a lit lamp in the darkness, an offered hand to someone in need had changed everything. In those quiet evening moments, with Penelope's head resting against his shoulder, he knew with absolute certainty that he had found his true home not in a place, but in the heart of the woman who had once been afraid to show her tears, and now laughed freely under the wide Wyoming sky.